Good evening, and thank you all for coming to this meeting this evening. This meeting is to pay tribute to Allan Armstrong, who was a Republican communist and a socialist, and very involved in independence, of course, for Scotland, and was a very well respected activist. So I'm going to say no more, but to hand over to Steve Freeman to pay Allan a tribute.
Okay, thank you, Carol. Okay, welcome, comrades. As I was thinking about this meeting, it feels like I am remembering a friend. It feels a little bit like the hardest meeting I can remember doing because you've got sadness and you've got good friendship and you've got some even conflicts and arguments that we had over our time. Of course, I've known Allan for over 40 years, so I'm just want to go over that, and I'm going to make a few introductory remarks before we begin, I think. And maybe if I just press that, it'll come up. Okay, a little preamble. I want to talk about these things. It's a lot about history, the times that we had together, political times mainly. So I'm going to make some preamble, a few comments before we begin. And then I'm going to talk about some of the political things we did together and end up with an assessment or make an assessment or beginning an assessment, I think, because an assessment comes from many people, not from one person. So I see that as making a contribution to this. And so I'm very interested. I know we've got Scottish comrades who know Allan well. I wanted to say a couple of things. Just this is preamble, if you like. First of all, the Republican Labour Education Forum is not a communist or Marxist forum as such. We came from the Labour left through the Corbyn movement. We have a range of views. So I'm speaking here very much in a personal capacity, with a perspective that's not necessarily shared by all RAF members, but I'm very pleased that the RAF is having this meeting. Obviously, Allan is well known on the Scottish left, but not so much in England. We've had him as a speaker at some of our, at least one of our meetings, if not more. So comrades here may not know. So comrades in England may not know much about Allan. Obviously, the comrades who are here from Scotland probably know more about Allan than I do. So that's that balance between people who know little and comrades who probably will know more than me. This story is really about Allan's politics, and it's far bigger than I could even think of covering in the short time that I'm going to be speaking to you. So I feel that no doubt there are more holes in this story than a Swiss cheese, but obviously comrades will be able to add all sorts of things into that. Allan and I had agreements and disagreements, including the moment when we were together and we split into two groups. However, standing back from that, some of this can be explained by our own political weaknesses and quite a bit that the political conditions in England and Scotland have been quite different. So we had different forces operating on us. There has been a real national democratic movement in Scotland, but not, I would say, not in England. So I think in Scotland, Allan has been swimming, as it were, with the tide or ahead of the tide, actually. Whereas in England, I sometimes feel I'm a bit more like a fish out of water. So that's a different thing. My final point, I think, before I begin, it's not begun yet, by the way, is that I was thinking that if Allan is up there looking down on us, he would absolutely love the idea that this meeting is taking place in England because of his idea of internationalism from below. I think he'd be over the moon about that. And so I'm pleased that we are having this discussion in England, and no doubt there'll be more discussions going on in Scotland as well. My first point then, before we begin, is to say that Allan was a good friend and comrade and ally over 40 years since when we first met. There are so many stories of things we've done together in friendship discussions we've had. I couldn't even begin to go into all of those. When I say comrade, I mean that we were in different groups together. We were in the SWP together. We were in the Republican faction together. We were in the Revolutionary Democratic group together. And after a gap, we were in the Republican Communist Network together. And at other times, we were allies. You know, when in the 2014 Scottish referendum, Allan came down to London. I went to Scotland when we were campaigning around the question of Scottish independence. So on all these different levels, I'm reminded, just one of the stories. I'm reminded that one time when I went to Edinburgh, and I met Allan at the Waverley station, and he said, "Let's go across the road for a pint." So we did. And we were drinking away in this pub. Well, I'm not drinking away too much, by the way, but we were drinking away when we got into a discussion with somebody who told us, and it was a great revelation, that in fact he was Banksy. And we began to have this discussion, and we afterwards we had another big philosophical discussion about this, because he told us a story that was both credible and incredible, that there was all sorts of information he gave us that made it seem true. And then we were going to go, well, why would Banksy be talking to two blokes in a pub? We couldn't believe it. And I remember afterwards walking through Edinburgh, through the park with Allan, having a great discussion, philosophical, about truth and whether it could be true, and so on and so forth. I have many stories like that, but I won't continue with those. Maybe except to say, you know, that Allan was a good friend for over 40 years. We spent a lot of time together. We spent lots of time discussing politics. He was a geography teacher, an inveterate traveller all over the world, and he was especially fond of Ireland, which he felt a particular connection to. And of course, he had I describe it as an encyclopedic knowledge of politics. And it's where I certainly learned a lot of my politics about Scotland in dialogue with Allan. So, if I was going to simply describe Allan's politics, one second, what am I looking for here? Yeah, if I was going to describe Allan's politics, that one, I need this one. I would pick out these particular points. I would pick out Scottish Republican, rank and file trade unionist, communist, internationalist. Carol's mentioned some of them already. Allan was very, very committed rank and file trade unionist. Of course, after he retired, that all changed, but he was an active member of the EIS in Scotland, the Education Institute of Scotland. He was always active in that union, both at his school level and other levels. I mentioned also the word Scottish. I'll focus on that, but not because I'm not speaking of Allan being ethnically Scots, because although he was born and brought up in the culture and everything of Scotland and had a Scottish accent. But for Allan, the important thing was not whether you were born in Scotland, but if you were a citizen of Scotland, if you were active in Scottish life. It didn't matter whether you were Polish or German or African or whatever it was, you were Scottish if you were a citizen of Scotland. And Allan was a very, very active contributor to politics and political life in Scotland. And again, as I say, comrades here will know a lot more about that than I do. I thought that I would, if I wanted to cite this period, I would, thinking about it, it's almost, I thought it was really between, my relationship with Allan is almost hangs around 4 referenda between 1978 and whenever. I've got the 1978 Scottish devolution referendum, the 1998 Scottish Parliament referendum, the 2014 Scottish independence referendum, and just being slightly mischievous, I've called the 2006 one the English independence, or the EU referendum, or the Brexit referendum as it's called. And I would kind of defend it as the English referendum, just to be mischievous. So let's just therefore look at Allan's politics and just say a little bit about that and where that comes from. I'm going to basically describe Allan as I'm basically going to talk about the politics of Republican communism, and I call it in the what I would say the era of the social monarchy. That is to say, the post-war welfare state. Because Allan was born in 1949, I was born in 1950. We all grew up in the post-war welfare state. How could we describe the politics and how do we assess the politics? Well, I'm going to use this little diagram to try and explain it. I think that what I might call Anglo-British or just British Marxism, if you prefer that, in this period where we were active was basically Stalinism of the Communist Party of Great Britain, or the successor of the communist of that, or Trotskyism, the SWP, the militant tendency, the WRP, the IMG in the 1970s and 80s. And I use Marxism here as a generic term to span all of that. And then I want to throw up this grey area over here. If we can see the grey area, imagine it's something smoky, something indistinct. What the heck's going on in this particular space, in this particular period? And I think that if I was to describe that space, that's, I think, the space we're going to be talking about. It's something emerging, something that is coming into that period. And I'm going to think of it, hold on a minute. Here we've got the same space again. World War II, Stalinism, Trotskyism. Here's that space over there. And I'm going to put into that space something that I'll call anti-British. So we have British Marxism. I'm going to call this anti-British Marxism. And I'm going to call it Republican communism. And I'm going to put something didn't come up at the right moment. If you go back, okay, so you've got anti-British Marxism and Republican communism. In this space on the right, I'm going to put Allan Armstrong right in the center of that diagram. If you go back, however, to World War One, then you've got something else. You've got James Connolly, you've got John McClain. And I think, therefore, the whole thing looks different if you look further back in history. I think I'm pretty sure Allan was a member of the John McClain Society. And he was very interested in James Connolly. I had the privilege of, Allan did a walking tour around Edinburgh, the James Connolly walking tour. And I had the privilege of Allan taking me around all the haunts and places where James Connolly had lived, and he lived in Edinburgh. And of course, both of these two, James Connolly and John McClain, were Republicans and communists. Connolly, of course, famously with the Easter Uprising 1916, and John McClain's famous slogan for a Scottish Workers' Republic. So what's happening here is that Allan is playing a big role in creating a kind of alternative, if you like, to the Stalinism and Trotskyism that dominated. And there comes AI. I knew it was going to come in. It came in at the wrong time. There's Allan. It's not the Automobile Association, by the way. It is Allan himself into that space. And so before I go on, I'm going to just say a little bit about this idea of Republican communism, and then just go back into our history. So what do I understand? Because I can see Allan, but I see Allan through my own eyes. If he was there, he'd correct me in some way or show me where I go, whatever, we'd have a thing. But I see it a little bit like this. I've seen Republican communism, and notice that I put a hyphen between just on this one occasion, because I see Republican communism as being a kind of unity of opposites. They kind of go together. So on one side, you have republicanism, and the other side of the unity of opposites, you have communism. And in that, you have the national dimension of politics. And in the other hand, you have as it were, the international dimension. And then you have republicanism as being what some people would call the minimum program. And I would call it that. Allan wouldn't have called it that. I think he would have called it the immediate program. But anyway, that's terminology. Or the maximum program of communism. And in a sense, it's about journey and destination. In a certain sense, how do we get from where we are? What's the journey to get to this destination, which we might call the Republican road to world communism? And I'll just add one more to this before I dive back into our history. And I will say this little point here, I think. What do we mean by Republican communism? I think it is that capitalism is a world system, the working class is a world class, that communism is a world solution, that there is no socialism in one country, and that a democratic republic is universal. It's not something that just applies in a country that has a monarchy. It can apply as an argument in America or indeed all over the place, even countries which have republics already. And so I put that little bit down there. Democratic republicanism is distinct from anti-monarchism. That is to say, the US and France could have a republican communist tendency, not just us, because we've got a monarchy here, which of course they don't have. So that's the space that Allan is working around, that I'm working around, we're working around together in various ways. So I'm going to go back to, I'm going to start by going back to an organization that some people may never have heard of. I'm surprised if you wouldn't, but let's go for this. This is the Revolutionary Democratic Group, 1984 to 89. It called itself a faction of the Socialist Workers' Party. And I'm going to start here, and then I'm going to go backwards to the preceding part of this story before the Revolutionary Democratic Group. And just to introduce it, it was drawn to my attention recently, a story in the almost this month, a story in Construction News about a dispute in 1986. It was called the Langs Lockout Dispute, and in this story in Construction News, there is a special branch report for the 11th of March, 1986. There was a police spy cop, if you like, called Nicholas Green, and he has a report of this meeting, which is apparently signed off by a chief superintendent in the Met, and it sets off for Box 500, which is the name of MI5. It's a PO box that they used back in the war, and it's just become a word for that. And it's about an industrial dispute involving Brian Higgins, who's a building worker, a member of UCAT, and it says the left-wing Revolutionary Democratic Group. And as it happens, Brian did build a wall outside my house as well when he was an unemployed building worker, and I did employ him to build a wall outside my house. But anyway, there were 3 founder members of the RDG. 2 of them were at this meeting, and 1 of them wasn't. And so the question was, well, who was missing? Who wasn't at this meeting? Well, if you remember, this is London. The one who was missing, of course, was Allan, because he was up in Edinburgh at the time. So this group, I now thought I'll show you some of the materials that we produced. This is beginning in 1984. This was the newspaper that we had called Republican Worker. And you'll see why it had that name. And it's called The Fight for Workers' Unity. And it's about the miners' strike, no victimizations. There's a picture on there. And the front cover of this first issue of Republican Worker was written by Allan Armstrong. So he did the cover story for that. I'll mention another one. I'm going to mention a couple of these, including some things that Allan actually wrote and argued for. Here's the second issue, and it says, "Free all jailed miners." Again, the same miners' dispute is going on. This article was written by Brian Higgins, and in there, well, I thought I'd just show you this slightly, but it just amused me because we had a little cartoon here from Phil Evans, who was an SWP cartoonist. He's got Neil Kinnock there, and the Queen, get out of that, you obsequious bastard. And she's chopped his head off. And the article's called Rank and File Republicanism, Neil Kinnock. And it was written by a jail Kent miner serving 4 years in Maidstone prison. And interestingly, this miner talks about Queen Victoria, the Great Chartist Demo of 1848, and the fear that Queen Victoria had of there being a republic. And so Terry French writes about this, comments on it favourably, and we've included it in there. Why have I written this? He says, because we need a rank and file movement similar to the Chartists, a movement to represent the people of our land, not the greedy, self-centered leaders we have. So that just gives you a little flavour of what we were doing in this newspaper. And I'm going to mention the next thing, which was, here's an article in that called The Democratic Movement in Scotland, and it's signed by Allan Armstrong. And an interesting point for me there is that we didn't call it a nationalist movement. Most people spoke of it in maybe from England and other places, disparaging it as a nationalist movement. You know, and people said we don't have anything to do with nationalism, but we always described it, as Allan does here, as a democratic movement. We saw in it the potential for democracy in that national question. And I'm going to go to the next little piece if I can, because this is something that Allan then wrote. This is issue number 4. We've got the House of Commons there. Which way for the left? We were having a conference. Some issues of the paper we had there. And an article was written called Loyalist Pogrom or Democratic Revolution. And this article was written by Allan. And so I want to, at the end of this article, I think he kind of sums up the politics of the Revolutionary Democratic Group at that time. So he says this, I'll have to just move these because I can't see the own thing over here. We go. A victory for Republicans, and he's talking about Ireland because we did talk a lot about Ireland in the 1980s. A victory for the Republicans would gravely, says Allan, weaken the British state, encouraging resistance from the working class and oppressed over here. The cement holding the United Kingdom together would crumble, would begin to crumble. Is it? Oh yeah, begin to crumble, leading to the radicalisation of the national movements in Scotland and Wales. It says the monarchy and archaic constitution would be brought into question. The democratic revolution would spread to the mainland. That was the perspective that Allan saw at that time. And if we just add the little bit more to that, he says this, it's his kind of concluding point, and it kind of sums up the RDG. What is needed is a mass rank and file Republican movement in England, Scotland, and Wales, with the working class taking the lead in a democratic revolution to break up the British state and open the road to international socialism. This is the distinctive programme advocated by the RDG. And so Allan is summing up the kind of argument we had there back in, this is 1986, with Republican worker. Now, there are a few more of these, and I won't keep you going on this, but I've taken a few more cases, but I think I'll just whip through these very quickly. There's that one. Allan's writing about the doomsday scenario. There's this one where Allan writes about self-determination. And notice he says in this bit here, it's an article out of it, organise against the poll tax and for a democratic republic. And so Allan was very keen on not the idea of self-determination, but played a very important role in the anti-poll tax movement. I think, and comrades will correct me, he was the chair of the Edinburgh anti-poll tax movement, but I'll be corrected on that. But he linked that movement, the democratic movement against the poll tax, as the kind of leading to the direction of a kind of Republican movement, a movement for democratic change. And of course, he wasn't wrong in that, because it's that anti-poll tax movement in Scotland that fed into the campaign for a Scottish Parliament. So that was leading us towards the second big movement that Allan was involved in. Now, I'm going to go backwards in time now. I'm going to go back before the RDG to a step before that, and show you where that group came from. And I've got that one. This is another one of the issues of our thing. We've gone over to a magazine by this time, by the way. Here we've got Irish Sorrows, poll tax and Scottish politics we're discussing. This is an article, Govern and the Working Class. That's Allan writing about the working class there in Govern. So the next one will be the Republican faction. We have to wind before the RDG came something called the Republican faction, which was a grouping within the Socialist Workers' Party, which took up the national question. And essentially what happened was, we go back to this point, here is where it all began. There is two things that's happening here. First of all, Allan, we were both SWP members. Allan did the pamphlet. This is the pamphlet on the left, written by Allan for the SWP, Nationalism or Socialism. Afterwards, he didn't like that pamphlet very much, and we moved away from that pamphlet. In this one over here, this is the first issue of Socialist Review, which is the Socialist Worker Party magazine. And I've got an article in there calling for a Scottish Workers' Republic. So where did all this stuff begin? How did it come about? Well, it began with the 1978-1979 Scottish devolution referendum. So I need to tell you a little bit about that. I don't know how we're doing for time, and then we'll come towards an end of it. So let me just talk about that for a little while. Well, the Republican faction, the first thing to say is that I met Allan in 1978, and I'm pretty sure it was at a conference of socialist economists in Glasgow. And the reason that we came there was for the same reason. There was a devolution bill. The Labour government had this devolution bill, and the SWP split three ways over it. Some people passionately argued we must vote no, we must abstain, or we must have a critical yes position. Now, because of this kind of contradiction, this brought me and Allan to this same conference where we met each other for the first time, and we were very interested in this. We thought, I did, he did, we thought it was a very important issue. And we thought that we began to think that the SWP wasn't interested in this referendum because they didn't see it as class politics. They saw it as a bit of a nuisance, but we had to do something about it. We had to take a position. But in fact, it proved to be very, very important. The Callaghan government was defeated over this bill, and it led to Thatcher's victory in the 1979 general election. So we felt that trying to get the SWP members to take this whole thing seriously when they weren't that interested in it was something that we had to do. And it was a democratic defeat. And the conclusion was, from that, as we tried to persuade the SWP to change their mind, our conclusion from this experience was as follows. Number one, the national question is about strategy and program. It's not just about how you vote in a referendum. We thought you needed a much bigger picture. We needed some sort of strategy, some sort of program or politics, which the SWP didn't have or didn't do or wasn't interested in strategy. Secondly, we believed that the national question will come back again. It would grow, even though it was now defeated. We were going to go through this dark night of Thatcherism, where everything was set back, where the working class was in retreat, but it would come. We were convinced it would come back again. And maybe when it came back again, we'd be in a better position to influence things. And then the third thing was this, that republicanism was the central democratic issue, which the SWP simply wasn't interested in at all, or didn't see the relevance or significance in. So that's how me and Allan came together. That's how we began talking, and we formed this faction. It was officially recognized faction. It had 40 supporters in 1980. We appeared at the conference after the devolution thing had been lost, trying to make this argument that they needed to really look at what they were doing more strategically. And then I'll make the next point, which I think is this. One of the important things that we had as an RDG, and this was that we agreed with the argument for a Federal Republic of England, Scotland, Wales, and the United Ireland. It was a demand which linked the Republican faction and the RDG, and it had its origins in Lenin's and Engels writing in State, well, Engels writing and Lenin quoting him in State and Revolution. But I'll have to add this: we had an uneasy articulation between, on one hand, Scottish independence, and the Federal Republic, an argument about breakup versus unity. And by the way, I just say this reappears later on in the context of Europe. And so there was a fault line here. And I think this is the fault line where, as we'll see in a minute, going from the RDG to the Republican Communist Network later on, and the 1998 Scottish Parliament referendum. I'm coming close to an end now, and I'm just going to say how I'd assess Allan's contribution, and it's not covered everything. In 1989, the RDG split. We went into different paths. Allan put more emphasis on breakup and independence, whereas I was still sticking with the Federal Republic argument. And also, Allan had a different orientation in Scotland. The poll tax, as I mentioned before, was a very important link to the National Democratic Movement. And at the time then of the 1997, 1998 referendum on the Scottish Parliament, we sort of came together again and we formed something called the Republican Communist Network. This involved, by the way, in a very funny way, the Communist Party of Great Britain, Leninist grouping, which is why probably I haven't seen, but I imagine Mary and Nick came together through this process, through the link with me and the CPGB. We all sort of came together through that process. And here's the thing that we produced at that time. This is just one example of it. We produced this thing called Republican Communist. We had a whole series of those before we again split. Eventually, we split again along national lines, really, because, well, we won't go into all that. But anyway, it became, I think, the Republican Communist Network (Scotland). So I'm going to come towards the end now, comrades, just to do a little sum up, I think, of Allan's contribution. And it's left many holes in here, as I say, Allan's contribution to Republican communism in Scotland. I've got the idea in my head, going back from where we were before, that in this era, Allan is developing an anti-British Marxism in the era of the social monarchy. And over here you can see there's the Stalinism of the CPGB, the Leninist faction and Weekly Worker coming out of that, the Trotskyist groupings, the kind of Republican communism that was developing out of the Republican faction, out of the RDG, and out of the Republican Communist Network. And Allan is absolutely central to this particular development, I would say. So if I was going to end by simply assessing Allan's contribution to this, I would do it a little bit like this, and I'd be interested to see what other comrades might have to say about that. Well, I think if we thought who was Scotland's two greatest revolutionary communists, it'd have to be James Connolly and John Maclean, no doubt about it. I thought about this a bit, and I thought I've put Allan as one of Scotland's most important Marxists. I might mention Tom Nairn, I might mention Neil Davidson, along with Allan. Really, to me, really important. There may be some other people that people would put into this pot, but I wouldn't have a hesitation of putting Allan in amongst them. But I would go a little bit further than that, and I would go Scotland's most important Republican communist is Allan. I put Tom Nairn in brackets because I'm not sure whether Tom Nairn certainly comes from a Marxist background. Whether we should see him as a communist, I'm not entirely sure. People might know Tom Nairn better, but Tom Nairn obviously is a very, very important contributor with his thesis of the breakup of Britain. But I would put Allan up there. Wider relevance? Well, I wouldn't like to just confine Allan to Scotland. Wider relevance, England, Wales, Ireland, how do we figure into that? I don't really know yet. I would say the future will confirm it. But I want to end on this point, if I could, before my final point, that here we have, and I'm going to end up here, the story. Allan's politics is going. Allan was in the middle of writing a book when he sadly passed away. The book is called From Pre-Brit to Ex-Brit Forging and forging and the forging and breakup of the UK and Britishness. And this is the head from this group is approved by the Ministry of Britishness. I notice Alan's having a little joke with us here. And of course, this is by Allan Armstrong. It's forthcoming in spring 2025. I've seen this book. It's maybe I think it's maybe 400 pages. I've scan read it very, very quickly. It's going to be a very important book full of a detailed historical story of the British Isles. And I think it will play a massive part in cementing Alan's position as a key person in Scotland and maybe even the rest of the UK. We will see. We don't go for that. So I think that is where I'm more or less going to end. I wanted to end with a kind of letter, I suppose. I was going to have a letter where I wanted to say, as if I was going to write to Alan, as if I hadn't seen him towards the end of his life. And I'd want to say to him, dear Alan, you have been a good friend, comrade, and ally to me. I salute you as a Republican communist, as an internationalist, as a campaigner for emancipation and liberation. Rest in peace. We will try to keep up your good work. I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, Steve. Very touching end to your talk. Very touching. If anybody also would like to share memories that they have of Alan, or would like to ask questions of Steve, please just put your electronic hand up and I will bring you in to talk. So Ken, I can see Ken. Ken, I'm going to bring you in now.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you very much, Steve. That was a great presentation. I confess that despite being Scottish, I didn't personally know Alan at all, or indeed know of him in my time up in Scotland, but my politics has changed significantly over the decades. I was only going to make a brief observation that there's a review that Alan did of The Red and the Green, a portrait of John Maclean, a biography written by Gerard Cairns. And in that review, he goes into some detail about his own history and politics. And he says that in characterizing his politics, he wouldn't use the term Marxist or Marxian, which is Marxian is what John Maclean might have said, because he saw it as too theological a term, reminiscent of Lutheranism or Calvinism. But he very much did characterize himself as a Republican communist, as you presented him here. So thank you again for your presentation. That's it.
Thanks very much, Ken. I'm going to bring in Bob.
Steve, thank you very, very much for and all the other comrades for hosting this meeting, and also for a really interesting and thought-provoking take on Alan. One thing did make me laugh was you said Alan had a Scottish accent, and actually he didn't. Actually, he had a kind of Geordie accent. But you'd have to be from your. Well, mind you, you're from Leeds, aren't you? So that I thought you would have recognised you didn't have a Scottish accent. Alan would have laughed at that. Anyway, thank you. I suppose I'll just say a couple of things quickly. One of Alan was brilliant at analysis. He was actually brilliant at taking in loads of facts and assimilating them and explaining their significance, and then feeding that into a strategy. I mean, I think that was one of his great strengths in the time that I knew him. I met him not that long. I met him during the miners' strike in 1984, and I became very close to him during the poll tax, when I recognised his strategic abilities, his ability to think, what's happening here? What do we need to do? And kind of draw principles from that. One of the things that was really important was his analysis, his historical understanding and analysis of the rise of the UK state as being part of the development of capitalism, particularly in England, but also in the central belt of Scotland. You know, that England, Britain, UK grew as capitalism developed. And I think his perspective was that capitalism is actually in decline. Historically, it's, and that as part of that, the UK is also in decline. And this is, you know, and in the heartland, if you like, this has led to a kind of right-wing shift, not just in the ruling class, but also in the working class. And as a kind of reflection of that was also in place in parts of Scotland, particularly in Ireland initially, but certainly in Scotland and in Wales, there was the rise of democratic movements, Republican democratic movements, which the left often characterized as kind of nationalistic. And, you know, the point that Allan kept bringing point with, there was a democratic core to this. It was progressive, it was democratic, and repeatedly arguing, I've been part of these debates, repeatedly arguing with courts, particularly in England, that to dismiss these movements is to make a fundamental mistake, and to think that socialism could arise through an unreformed United Kingdom was actually to live in the land of illusion. And to try, and it was really frustrating for Allan and for others, you know, to try and get comrades on board. You know, Allan's idea of internationalism from below involved, you know, Republican socialist parties developing in Ireland, in Scotland, in Wales, and in England, and that has yet to come to pass. But we live in hope. So I just wanted to say, well, I could say loads and loads about Allan, but just that kind of background, I think is really important. So, and that he was, above all, a radical Democrat, a Republican and a radical Democrat, and he saw democracy as a weapon that the working class had and could wield against the capitalist class, to unite our class against them, right? And it frustrated the hell out of him that other people, socialists, good in many, many ways, couldn't see that, you know, didn't see the Republican argument, you know, followed an economistic path, you know. So, and I think in Allan's book, which you referred to, Steve, he tries to draw all that together. And I think you've seen the final copy, which Nick and I edited, Nick Steph, that is, and that will be out, as you say, in spring. And I would encourage everybody to try and get a copy of that. We will make it very, very cheap, so that everybody can have a copy. And I think it will have a big impact. It's a big thing to read and digest, but it does capture his ideas really well, and I look forward to.
I hope. Just
sharing the debate.
Sorry, Bob. Just to make an immediate comment, not to get in the way of anybody else, but obviously, I hope when we get that book out and we can buy it, then we can have a meeting on it to discuss it in more detail. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay, I'll shut up now.
Thanks very much, Bob. Yes, I think we'll definitely be ordering that. But it's spring, is it? Can you pre-order, or it's got to wait till it comes out officially?
Well, if you let Steve know, Steve brings a big rucksack next time he goes.
Yeah,
to,
that's right. Yeah, I think it's a rucksack job, isn't it?
Edinburgh.
I think it's a rucksack.
A rucksack job. I like that. So I've got Leslie and Mary and Nick. So I'm bringing Leslie in now.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to everyone who's been involved in organising this wonderful memorial meeting, and thanks very much, particularly to Steve, for such a fantastic presentation. I'll be quick. My husband Graham, who's listening in, and I have first met Allan, I think it was in 1987, and he was so amazing. I mean, I learned so much from him. I then we both kind of dropped out of politics for a bit for various reasons, but much to my delight, we did actually get back in touch with Allan. It would be round about probably 3-4 years ago. And what I particularly wanted to mention was that apart from all the other wonderful things about Allan, speaking as a a gay man. He was such a wonderful LGBT plus ally, as is Myra. And we're both so grateful to him because, we never made a particular thing of it, but he was just, when various things became clear, it was just, absolutely, as far as he was concerned, it's just completely normal, which is what we want. Thanks so much. I'm sure. Well, anyway, sorry. Thank you.
Don't apologise at all. Thank you very much indeed, Leslie. I'm going to bring in Mary McGregor now.
Hi, everybody. Thanks very much. And thanks, Steve. It's really good to see you. It's been a long time. As one half of the couple for a federal republic up in Scotland at one point, it took me down memory lane a little bit. One thing I want to talk about is we've talked about Allan, the great theorist, the strategist, and all the tremendous things he was, what a thinker, what a writer. But I want to just actually follow on from what Leslie was saying and talk about his humanity. It's very easy for people with the kind of politics that we have, the kind of politics that Allan had, to be labelled as quite hard, to be labelled as quite dogmatic. Allan was never ever like that. Allan was incredibly open to ideas. He would debate and discuss with anybody and learn. He was prepared to learn from people as well. He was never so arrogant as to think that, oh, I know it all, I've got it all, I've sussed it all out. That wasn't Allan. And it was this humanity, I think, that drew many of us in Scotland to him. His time in Scotland, particularly the work that we did in the Scottish Socialist Party together, meant that Allan's reputation was, yes, of a great Republican communist, but also of somebody of great integrity, of great honesty, and of great humanity, who could understand people's plight, who could empathise with people in struggle, whatever nature that struggle might be. And he's greatly missed by all of us here. We were devastated when he died, and we're still devastated, and will continue to be so, because it's left a huge hole in our lives and in the political life of Scotland. So I think that's really about all I wanted to say. I just don't want anybody who didn't know Allan to have a kind of almost a one-dimensional view of him as just this thinker, political person. He was somebody who loved culture, he loved music, he loved a sing-song, he loved poetry, he loved art. He would talk with you for hours about whatever programme had been on the telly, and he would not dismiss something as, oh, that's just popular culture and a piece of nonsense. He would analyse it and think about the impact that it was having on people. So yeah, he was a tremendous friend, a tremendous influence, and Steve's right. Those of us who were his comrades know that the best thing we can do is to try in whatever ways we can to carry on his work. So thanks for organising the meeting, and thanks, Steve, for the wee trip down memory lane.
Thank you very much, Mary. It was lovely to hear more of the human side. He sounds an absolutely amazing man. Thank you very much for that, for telling us about that side of him. I'm going to bring Nick in now.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd like to just kind of echo what others have said in terms of thanking you for organising the meeting and for Steve's contribution there. I suppose what I'm going to say is kind of been already kind of covered by some of the other contributions, but I just kind of wanted to say that anyway, that Allan will no doubt be rightly remembered for his extensive and insightful kind of writings on Scotland, on Ireland, the national question, and his theories around internationalism from below, radical democracy, etc., that he's produced extensively over decades, over many years. But I think it's also important to remember that Allan was not just about the theory, but he was very much about putting the theories and his beliefs into practice. And Steve, you kind of touched on that, and others have touched on it. But I think, where if there was a campaign happening that Allan was involved in it, and going back to before I knew him in terms of the poll tax, Steve touched on his kind of commitment to the rank and file movement within the teachers' union, the EIS in Scotland. Also, the James Connolly commemoration in Edinburgh. Alan was a regular committed attender to the demonstrations there that regularly got attacked by loyalists, but he was there every year, and that was one of the key things that he was involved in. And then obviously the Scottish Socialist Party, where he's regularly on stalls, played an active role in his branch in the national aspects of the SSP as well. And obviously when the SSP dissolved, collapsed, etc., went on to was what I think probably one of the founding members in terms of the radical independence campaign, and he was re-energized with that, and got very involved in terms of kind of cultivating younger comrades to kind of get involved in the struggle, and he was kind of very good at that. The final point I just wanted to mention, and it kind of carries on a little bit from what Mary said there, that was the final thing was about Alan's approach to his comrades and political opponents. In debate, whether it was on paper or in person, Alan always treated those that he debated with or disagreed with respect. He always dealt with our arguments and combated arguments that he disagreed with, rather than attacking the person and getting into petty point scoring or trading of insults, as I'm sure those of us that have been on the left for many years have kind of experienced in different organizations. And Alan was, kind of so different in that respect, that he wanted to kind of get to the truth and have that debate and discussion. And I think that was, for me, that it was a kind of a great lesson, and it's something that's really, really stuck with me. So I think, there are the three aspects: as his theoretical writings, his commitment to activity and action, and also thirdly, in terms of I think the phrase that Mary used, in terms of his humanity and the way he treated people with respect. And I think that to kind of sum up, it made him a true Republican communist in that way.
Thank you very much, Nick. Also, a lovely, lovely tribute. I've got Nick and then John. Nick, I'm bringing you in now.
Thank you. Yeah, I haven't known Alan for nearly as long as many people who've spoken already. I got to know him through Edinburgh Rick, and just shortly before his death, I was getting to know him much better on a personal level. We were both involved in the Another Europe is Possible campaign, and then in Ukraine Solidarity. So both of which obviously were very much about internationalism from below and combating the rise of the far right, which unfortunately has risen even further. I mean, my own political background is somewhat different, sort of originally an anarchist, then very much in sort of pressure group, and more recently Scottish Green Party. So I didn't have the same background in Marxism. He said to me that he wouldn't call himself a Marxist, which rather surprised me. But I think I understand now why he said that. But getting to know him was a very good experience, and there've been very few people I've met in life for whom I developed such a liking and respect for once I knew them very quickly. And it was terribly sad from a personal point of view that he became ill and died kind of just as I was getting to know him much better. He is greatly missed on a personal as well as a political level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thanks very much for that. And John, bringing you in now.
Thank you very much. I didn't know Alan anywhere near the scale that people on here did. I met him twice, I think, and It's the once that I met him in Edinburgh, which really impressed me in the ways which Scottish comrades have talked about, that he was. I mean, I used to read avidly what he wrote in Bella Caledonia, being half Scots, and I remember two things in particular: him going out of his way to literally take me to the right bus stop to go and get back down to Leith, where I was staying during this conference that we were both at. And secondly, when the conference had finished, me, Bob, Gupiel, and Alan and others retired to this pub in just by Waverley Station. It wasn't far from it anyway. And we had something like a 2-hour conversation over several points about whether there was such a thing as cultural appropriation in music, or whether it was just fusion. I think we came to the conclusion it was more fusion than it was cultural appropriation. But yeah, he was clearly a great human being who had time for people, and also someone who was really very holistic in the life that he led. Interest in the arts, interested in music, as other people have said at length. I just wanted to add to that very shortly.
Thanks very much, John. It seems as if these tributes are absolutely lovely. I didn't know Allan at all, because I only knew him from a talk he'd given to one of our meetings. But now I really wish I had known him. All of these are so lovely. All these lovely stories and about the kind of man he was. Is absolutely wonderful to hear it all. Right, so if anybody else would like to talk, would like to give memories of Allan as the person or his politics, anybody else would like to talk, please just do come in, raise your hand and speak to the meeting. No, I can't see any more hands up. And so I'm going to go back to Steve then for some concluding remarks. Steve, back to you.
Thank you, Carol. I'm muted now. Thank you, Carol. A couple of small points that just picking up from what Comrade said before I just try to draw it to an end. I agree with Allan on the term Marxist. I think we can use the term Marxist because it's shorthand. Many people on the left understand what that means, but I don't like those personalized terms, and Allan clearly didn't either. Why attach yourself to one person? You shouldn't do that. Communism. Marx was Marx would have called himself a communist, and Marx made a contribution to communism. And I think that's a much better way of describing the politics, by putting forward the ideas of democracy, communism, republicanism. So, Allan, I agree with Allan certainly on that. I was mentioning what Bob said. I think the importance of democracy in all of this, which we were trying to fight against, and what's governed, I suppose. Anyway, democratic republicanism is an attitude. It's not just that you want to have a republic. It's an attitude to how you relate to other people, to an attitude towards democracy, which at the end of the day, most of us learnt by being active in the trade union movement. That's, if we've understood democracy, that's where we've probably learnt our democracy from. I was amused at that police report, by the way. It just made me think when I saw it, that described Brian Higgins as a member of, quote, the left-wing Revolutionary Democratic Group. And I thought, what left-wing Revolutionary Democratic Group? And I think, I'm wondering whether, because we've included the word democratic in there, the copper must have thought, well, people won't understand. If democracy is about the bourgeoisie, it's about capitalism, why, if they call it democratic, what does that mean? And we better make sure everybody understands this is a left-wing group. Because democracy, the idea of democracy, is being expropriated. really by the bourgeoisie. And really what we're doing here is taking back democracy, taking back the ideas of democracy to the working class movement, to the people. And that's what Allan was fundamentally about, and that was how he conducted himself. I'm really pleased to hear that all the comrades that spoke, and Mary, Nick, and Leslie and Bob, all of whom tell me or talk about the Allan Armstrong that I knew, in his humanity, his ideas, etc. I mean, that did probably come over in my contribution, but it was fantastic. I always believe that we get a fully rounded view when we have a meeting and everybody comes in and makes their points and makes their contributions. I'm very pleased to hear that. There is a massive hole in politics, in my politics, in life, because of Allan's passing. It is very sad for all of us. It is, what else can I say, really? But the best thing we can do, I suppose, in tribute to Allan, is to continue the struggle for the politics that he was arguing for. And I hope that's what we'll continue to do while we can continue. So I think that's where I probably draw it to a close. Thank you, comrades, for coming and contributing. And there's a lot more to think about. I felt, by the way, just this, I really thought I'd kind of run out of time. I think I only reached the year 2000 in my contribution. So there was that. We certainly never reached the Scottish referendum 2000. There was so much more. The more I looked at it, the more bigger it got. But you know, how can you sum up any person's contribution very easily like that? Thank you very much, comrades, for attending, and I hope this meeting contributes to further discussions and further understanding of Allan. And when his book comes out, I'm sure we'll be able to have meetings around his book. Thank you all.
Okay, Bob, bringing you in.
Well, if everything works out, we will be having a commemoration event for Allan in the new year, and if all goes well, we will produce a pamphlet that collects the contributions that people make. So between now and that event, if you are invited and you are asked to speak, we will be asking you if you could give us a written version of what you say as well, so we can bring that together into some sort of commemorative document. That's the plan, and hopefully it'll come to fruition.
Good, excellent, lovely to hear that. Thanks very much, Bob. Right, so I think it's just over to Steve again to say goodbye.
Well, I'm going to say goodbye, comrades. Thank you for attending. And we're going to learn more about Allan's politics as time goes on. And I think, as I said, I think his, he's not famous in one sense, but I think his reputation will grow. And I think the book will also add to that. So that's all I can really say. I think I won't repeat myself now. Thank you, comrades, for attending, and thank you for your contributions.